So here's a controversial question that I want to talk about today, which is, should we feel sorry for the elites of our society, or the billionaires and the oligarch politicians? Now, most people, when encountering this question, intuitively probably say
No! Hell no!
And that's because they often will either see the high elites as being either demonic supervillains or angelic superheroes. Now, if you see them as demonic supervillains, you see them as these hateful figures that are destroying society in various ways. Or else, if you see them as an angelic superhero, you might see them as inspiring individuals that lead great lives. Now, I'm going to argue that actually there's a case to be made for seeing them as tragic figures. Now, before anyone gets pissed about this, I'm going to note that I'm not the first person to have this intuition. For example, Bob Marley famously said, "Some people are so poor, all they have is money." And in doing that, he was making a powerful political statement, because one of the most dominant mythologies we have in our society is that rich and powerful people are there because they're hardworking, or they're somehow brilliant, or they're somehow these heroic type figures, or if not heroic, at least awe-inspiring in some kind of way, and that they live lives that we should aspire to. And Bob Marley was pointing out, saying, actually, in many ways, people like this live in a certain form of poverty, a poverty of social relations, a poverty of connection. They're actually deeply alienated, they can be deeply unhappy, and so throw themselves into power mongering. So I'm going to give you some reasons why you might want to view powerful people as figures of pity rather than figures of either disgust or admiration. Now, one of my favorite science fiction books is Dune. But in Dune, there's this evil, grotesque family called the Harkonnen, House Harkonnen. If you've watched the film, you probably would be disgusted by Baron Harkonnen, who's this kind of grotesque figure who keeps slaves, who endlessly seeks after power, who murders people, probably eats babies, all sorts of horrific things, right? This guy is a kind of paragon of evil and cold, calculated greed. Now, when I see a figure like that, it's true that I do feel disgust towards them, but I actually simultaneously am thinking to myself, that can't be a happy situation to be in. Who wants to live in this horrendous, cold, paranoid environment? Nobody in House Harkonnen seems particularly happy. In fact, they all seem like they're constantly paranoid and constantly watching their backs. And this is actually also an intuition I've had about, for example, medieval kings. If you think about medieval kings, we're trained to imagine that they're in this sort of position of power and they get all this luxury and they get to have feasts and so on. But really, the life of a medieval king is full of fear and paranoia, this constant sense that you're about to be overthrown by people around you, this constant sense that you can't trust people. In a weird way, this figure of the king living in their big cold castle, we could actually feel some kind of pity towards them, as well as forms of disgust. Now, one of the reasons why this is a particularly controversial topic right now is obviously because of the Epstein files. We see this evidence of this elite network of power players who are doing deals together, and obviously at the dark, grotesque core of that is this network of sexual abuse and trafficking, where many, many women have been used, abused, and treated like some kind of currency between powerful men. And when you're looking at an elite network like this, it looks a lot like House Harkonnen. You're seeing these kind of grotesque power figures doing what they do. Now, for somebody like me who basically enjoys simple things like making fires on beaches and playing guitar and hanging out with friends, that world looks very unappealing. So when I see people inside it, I'm not filled with some sense of like, wow, wouldn't it be great to have a yacht? Actually, it looks terrible to me. So when I'm approaching figures like that, my first thought is the question of, why is it that you are drawn towards that? What are you missing in your life that you seek this parody of success, or this parody of power, or this kind of cliched, high-flying world of materialism? Is that something that's really actually enjoyable? Are you truly happy there? Or are you there because you're kind of seeking something that you're missing? This is a controversial perspective, because the way that many people want to approach this is to say that we should be disgusted by the 1%, and who cares about what their internal emotional landscape is like. Now, I do understand that intuition, but I want to remind people that actually for the elite in our society, they actually don't mind whether they're cast as being superheroes or supervillains, because both of those perspectives position them as people with high levels of agency who are in control of their own destiny. So somebody like Elon Musk, for example, loves it if you idolize him. He loves it if you think that he's a superhero. But actually, he doesn't necessarily mind it either if you think he's a supervillain, because the supervillain type of character is somebody who's also in control of their own lives, blazing forward, making things happen. Elon doesn't mind it if people hate him. If you feel sorry for him though, that's a different story. Probably the most damaging thing for their self-identity is when they think that people see them as neither superheroes nor supervillains, but rather as tragic figures whose lives are to be avoided. And it really isn't in the interest of billionaires to be perceived as tragic figures. But let's actually take a step back to explore what a tragic figure actually is by turning to the original meaning of it from ancient Greek plays. Now, in Aristotle's Poetics, he writes about tragic heroes who are these characters who start off with elements of virtue, but who fall for the dark side, as it were, not through vice or depravity, but through hamartia, which either refers to some kind of mistake made by the character, like some wrong turn they've taken in the path of life, which has led to them being stuck in some irreversible situation. Or it can refer to some kind of flaw in the character, a bit like a small crack in a diamond. They've got some weak point in their character that they cannot fully control and that they end up getting controlled by. They are not a master of their passions, but rather get mastered by their own passions and possessed by them, allowing themselves to be exploited by dark forces that well up within themselves. Now we find characters like this, for example, in Shakespeare's plays, the figure of Macbeth, for example, or Othello. But we also find these characters in modern pop culture. A classic example of this is Anakin Skywalker from Star Wars, a Jedi who eventually turns into Darth Vader after allowing the dark side to take him over. Also a character like Boromir in The Lord of the Rings, who starts off virtuous at some level, but who finds himself getting taken over by the dark forces of the ring. Now, Aristotle notes that tragic figures like this are supposed to be objects of pity, but pity here doesn't mean that you're supposed to forgive the character for their actions, but rather you're supposed to feel some kind of sense that they're entrapped and that an earlier version of themselves would be horrified by what they've become, and that at some level they realize they've become stuck in a dark, corrupted version of themselves. Now, there's a really interesting variant of this character that we find in the film Spirited Away by Miyazaki, and this is the character of No Face. Now, this character No Face is initially this lonely ghost that is sort of struggling to connect with the other spirits in the spirit world that he's living in. And the protagonist, Chihiro, arrives on the scene and he tries to connect with her, but the way he tries to do it is actually by giving her things, giving her material goods. Basically, he tries to connect through materialism, but it doesn't really work. But as the film goes on, he gets more and more grotesque and eventually turns into this kind of monster of consumption, producing enormous amounts of gold in order to get ever more food to get bigger and bigger. And the basic moral of the story is that this lonely ghost or this hungry ghost is basically turning to consumption and materialism in order to fill some kind of void inside himself. And in the process is turning into some kind of monster. Now eventually he actually gets saved by Chihiro, which she basically forces him to vomit up all his wealth and return to being just an ordinary ghost, and basically teaching him that he doesn't need material goods in order to connect with people. And so he ends the film as being this humble ghost with a small community just eating simple food again. Now the reason why this scene has often actually fascinated me is that it actually mirrors various experiences I've had in the crypto community. So I used to hang around in the early crypto scene before it was a big thing. And at that time, the types of people who were in that scene were just totally ordinary individuals. And actually many of them were also nerdy and shy and quite awkward individuals. But fast forward 10 years into the future, and a significant number of those people have become incredibly wealthy from being early accumulators of crypto tokens. And you'd see all this bizarre behavior starting to emerge, where they were buying luxury mansions that were way too big for them, or spending obscene amounts of money on parties and so on. And it reminds me a lot of that scene in Spirited Away, where this once humble ghost turns into this kind of grotesque parody of consumption. Now this is one way of viewing these elite type figures, is that they start as actually ordinary individuals who have their own insecurities and vulnerabilities and then are transformed into these grotesque types of figures when they get too much power. It's almost like their neural circuits, their emotional circuits are unable to handle the situation they end up in, and they start to break up from within. So in a sense, how this narrative works is that we start with this person who's fairly ordinary or normal, but they're chasing something. But they then find that as they get it, it brings them no joy, and they start getting entrapped by the process of chasing after more and more. And in the process of doing this, they start to actually lose community and a sense of perspective. But because they're so far into this process, because they've sacrificed so much to try to get to where they've got, the only option they've left with is to throw themselves even more into this, and to end up almost being enslaved by the points system of that power game. So in a recent Instagram reel, my friend Max Haven noted that this process can actually cut them adrift from the rest of society, leaving them unmoored and in need of ever more material goods as a kind of teddy bear.
So why do billionaires have like all of this incredibly ostentatious, expensive stuff? You know, like their own private blimp, their name written in an asteroid, and their private zoo with animals that can sing their names, all of this nonsense. Like, why do they have all of this stuff? This is like a very expensive teddy bear. These people have basically lost their soul to capitalism, right? They have basically sold everything in order to succeed in a world, and they're part of a very small community, most of whom are competitive with one another. Ultimately, the problem with rich people throughout history is they alienate themselves from the rest of the human species and community so much that they need objects, very expensive objects, to convince themselves that they're a higher form of being, because they can like go out and collect the world's greatest pieces of art, because they know how to go and discerningly buy a yacht from a yacht merchant, that they're somehow worthy of the wealth they have accumulated.
Now, there's a whole debate to be had about why people might throw themselves into various forms of power mongering or wealth accumulation as a kind of compensation for something in their lives. But even if you are some kind of stable individual who's ended up in that situation through, for example, just luck or hard work or something like that, there's a lot of questions about what that situation ends up actually doing to you. One of the big problems for people like this is once they end up in a position of power, their social relations start to break down. This is a well-known phenomenon with rock stars, for example. In fact, celebrities often feel deeply alienated by the way that the public treats them as objects to be consumed, rather than subjects with emotion. So George Harrison, for example, noted that the main problem with fame is that the people you meet forget how to act normally. They are not in awe of you, but in awe of the thing they think you've become. What's going on here is that they become surrounded by people who want stuff from them, who want to get some of that power, who want to suck some of that reflected glory from them. A great movie about this is Rocketman, a biopic about Elton John, in which he finds himself surrounded by all these kind of sycophantic groupies who are feeding his ego but not feeding his soul. And eventually he turns away from them in disgust and tries to find something real, tries to find some true love. What ends up happening to these high-profile people, whether they be celebrities or billionaires or kings, is a strange combination of things. On the one hand, they start getting delusions of grandeur because they become surrounded by all these yes men who are trying to suck up to them constantly. On the other hand, they become deeply distrustful of the social network that surrounds them, but it can also make them feel deeply isolated and unstable. A really excellent book that picks up on this theme is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which is all about the character of Thomas Cromwell, who basically manages to get into the confidence of Henry VIII, who is paranoid and distrustful of all the aristocratic elites around him who are all trying to manipulate him in various ways, and who, as a result of this, turns to Cromwell to give him sage advice. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on the deep psychology of wealth and elite status, but here are a few more factors to consider, which might contribute to alienating these power figures from the society around them, and which make them feel isolated, alone, and disconnected in various ways. Firstly, extreme wealth can give people a huge buffer against risk, which can start to actually desensitize them to the things that ordinary people care about and talk about and discuss and share with each other. And this can actually lead to feelings of separation. This was actually a big theme in the film Titanic, where the pampered upper-class woman finds herself strangely drawn towards the more raw, rough, and risky, but also communitarian world of the working-class hero and his friends below deck. There is always a sense that somehow really rich people become disconnected from everyday joys. Secondly, one of the reasons why powerful people are actually poor in social connections is also partly because they can always just call in the market in place of social relations. Now, for ordinary people, community is something that is maintained through acts of reciprocity. For example, you and your friend might help each other when you're moving apartments. You'll call on a social network. You'll build these ties of solidarity with people to help you out. But the super wealthy always have this option to simply substitute that for strangers from the market. Rather than relying on friends and community for favors, they can just pay a stranger to make something happen. So in doing that, they actually slowly start to atrophy their own social networks. It's like if you don't use a muscle, it starts to disintegrate. Similarly, if you have money, you basically get to never have to use your social muscle, and this slowly starts to break down your social relations. So when this is now combined with the fact that you're surrounded by these sycophantic yes men who are trying to get stuff from you, that further breaks down into this distrust of people around you. And finally, this fact that you can make anything appear around you at any point in time can also make consumption seem more banal. Consumption actually gets a lot more joyless if everything always seems within reach. Consumption loses its richness or loses its depth of feeling. A little bit akin to an addict who becomes desensitized to the drug they're taking and who needs ever higher doses to get their fix. It has some echoes of that myth of King Midas, who can turn anything around him into gold, but in so doing makes his environment ever more joyless. The super rich can basically reach for anything their heart desires, but in a strange way, this golden touch that they have can make the true spirit of things, the joy within things, recede from them, which actually starts to make you feel kind of numb. So a particularly stark portrayal of this kind of monetary disassociation can be found in Cosmopolis, in which this billionaire speculator is chauffeured around New York, desperately searching for something to make him feel anything. He's almost completely severed from the more down-to-earth aspects of life that most people treasure, to the point where he actually no longer even cares if he lives.
My personal fortune is in ruins, and there's been a credible threat on my life. Makes me feel free in a way I've never known.
So these are some of the reasons why Bob Marley said, some people are so poor, all they have is money. And I think this is actually an important political intuition. Now, I obviously understand that there are ambiguities to this, and of course I understand that a person living in extreme poverty will yearn for resources. And of course, in that context, the life of a billionaire looks like some kind of utopia. But in the end, the deep political message being articulated by someone like Bob Marley is basically that those who quote-unquote succeed at capitalism do not necessarily somehow live the best lives, and by extension, those who quote-unquote fail at capitalism do not live worthless lives. Bear in mind at the core of much conservative business ideology is this idea that if you are poor, you have some kind of moral failing, that you are weak and undeserving. And in this context, pointing out that billionaires are actually, in fact, tragic figures is an attack on that value set. And it's also an attack on a society that tells you that the only thing worth living for is material wealth. Now, I'm well aware that what I'm saying here is kind of controversial, and I'm not even sure if I fully buy my own argument, but I'd like to put it out there and see what you think about it. So tell me in the comments, am I totally wrong on my intuition here, or is there actually a case to be made for positioning the powerful elites of our society as tragic figures? Do we really gain from seeing them as supervillains? I hope you've enjoyed this. Please do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this, and see you next time. Cheers.